With today's low milk prices and rising feed protein costs, now is the time to turn up the dial on rumen efficiency. Nitrosure, precision-release nitrogen, is designed to help stabilize rumen ammonia pools by synchronizing carbohydrate and nitrogen availability to the microflora. Providing a consistent supply of ammonia is proven to increase rumen microbial populations, improve fiber and dry matter digestibility, and stimulate microbial protein yield, all leading to greater efficiencies in forage utilization and higher milk and milk component production. Maximize rumen microflora with Nitrosure to turn up rumen efficiency and productivity.
For today's Real Science webinar, we're going to take a closer look at how feeding behaviors impacts production and overall health. Dr. Trevor DeVries has spent his career studying the interactions between animal behavior, nutrition, and performance. I would now like to introduce Dr. Trevor DeVries. Dr. DeVries was an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, where he had the opportunity to participate in dairy cow research. This led to an interest in nutritional management, animal welfare, and behavior. After receiving his PhD in 2006, he worked for 1 year as a postdoctoral researcher at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, focusing on ruminant nutrition. In 2007, he joined the faculty of the University of Guelph. Dr. DeVries is currently a Canada Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Behavior and Welfare and an Associate Professor in the Department of Animal Biosciences. He also coaches the university's Dairy Challenge team. Dr. DeVries, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here presenting. I hope you can see my slides and look forward to this webinar here today. As introduced, we're going to talk about understanding dairy cow feeding behavior to optimize nutritional management. And as was introduced, what I'd really like to cover is really a compilation of the data and studies that we've conducted over the years related to this topic area. First, introducing why behavior and specifically feeding behavior is important, and then talk a little bit practically about how we apply that knowledge when it comes to diets and nutritional management on farm. And so to jump right in, to ask the question, why do we care about feeding behavior? The first and probably simplest answer that I can give is the fact that feeding behavior of dairy cows is inherently tied to their dry matter intake or their overall intake level. And if we want cows to change their level of dry matter intake, then that must be mediated through some change in the feeding behavior of cows. And we know that in the dairy business, the business is to make milk. And one of the limiting factors is the amount of nutrients that cows consume to be able to produce that milk. And while we do look for efficiencies as well, still at the end of the day, the total amount of milk that a cow produces is going to be tied to the total amount of feed that cow can consume and the amount of nutrients that she can convert into milk. And so if we want that cow to alter her intake level or consume more feed, that has to be done through some kind of change in feeding behavior. And that's really because the intake level of the cow is really a mathematical function of her feeding behavior. If we think about how many meals a cow has per day, it's really the number of those meals per day and the size of those meals. And if you multiply those two things by simple math, you get the dry matter intake level of the cow. Same thing goes with the amount of times cows spend feeding. For example, she spends a certain amount of time at the feed bunk per day. She's going to eat her feed at a certain feeding rate. And if you multiply those two together, you get her dry matter intake. And so for a cow to consume more feed, she either needs to, say, spend more time eating, eat faster, or some combination of those two things. And same thing goes with the meal patterns of the cow as well. The question becomes well, what is the most important when we think about what are the most important aspects of feeding behavior for that cow? And realistically, all these things that are shown here meal size, meal frequency, eating time, eating rate are all contributors to the overall eating behavior and dry matter intake level of those cows. Now, we have tried to model this out in the past to look at, okay, which ones might be explaining, say, the most amount of variation in that dry matter intake. And this is data from a study that we conducted a few years back, where we took data from previous studies actually, and then ran a multivariable analysis to look at which variables best predicted dry matter intake and other variables that we had in that data set. And what we see in this case here is that dry matter intake was most associated with feeding time and meal frequency. So how much time the cows were spending at the feed bunk per day, as well as how often they are going there for a new meal over and across the day. And in that data set, both the rate of feed consumption as well as the size of meals were also correlated with dry matter intake, but not explaining as much variability. And so what this tells us is it's important to maximize, or allow at least that cow to maximize the amount of time that she can spend eating at the bunk, as well as the number of times that she can get there. And we can think about then what type of dietary factors as well as management factors might be conducive to that type of behavior. And we can also think if there's certain things that may limit that cow. So if you think of these cows here that are consuming a lot of feed, if they're not able to spend at least, say, 4 or 5 hours per day at the feed bunk, that might then limit how much feed those cows can actually consume at the end of the day. Now, in addition to how much feed the cow consumes, we also know that the eating behavior patterns of cows can directly relate or influence how the cow actually digests her feed. And we think about the function of the rumen and the health of that rumen. And one of the things that immediately comes to mind is, say, cows having very large meals eaten very quickly. And what happens in those cases is that you get a very large or quick accumulation of feed in that rumen. That's associated with a very quick digestion, and particularly of, say, the most rapidly fermentable carbohydrates, a quick pool of volatile fatty acids gets produced that drops rumen pH, and that drop in pH and that accumulation of acid may then have influences on rumen function, including, say, decreasing the activity of the fiber digesting bacteria, potentially blocking some of the biohydrogenation that occurs there, which may then trickle down in terms of having effects on things like milk fat production in that cow. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that we see direct links between the eating patterns of cows and some of those productive outcomes, like milk components, as well as the overall efficiency of digestion in those cows. And this is just an example of that from a study from a number of years ago, just showing an association now, and again, not very strong, but it's still there. And what we're seeing is about 30% of the variability, in this case, in this data set, in milk fat content in cows that are all on the same diet, all eating a very similar level of dry matter intake, same diet, about 30% of the variability in that being explained by their meal frequency, whereby those cows that are having more meals per day having greater milk fat. And we can think about the cause and effect there being basically the potential for those cows who are eating more often, having a more steady flow of nutrients into their rumen, avoiding those large within-day depressions in rumen pH, stabilizing that rumen, and potentially minimizing the risk of things like milk fat depression, optimizing biohydrogenation and fiber digestion in that rumen, all things which may at the end of the day contribute to, say, better milk fat in those cows. In addition to that, we know also, as I mentioned before, things like efficiency of production can be influenced there as well. And this is some data that comes from an Israeli group from a few years back, whereby they took cows and classified them based on their efficiency. And in this case, they were looking at their residual feed intake and classified cows as being either of low, medium, or high efficiency. And what they observed when they looked at the temporal eating patterns of those cows is that they saw a difference in those eating patterns, whereby those cows that were highly efficient, so in the darkest line here, the solid black line here, those cows not only consumed a slightly less amount of dry matter intake, which we typically see with more efficient animals, but they're having lesser kind of peaks in their dry matter intake at these times of the day when we see the cows eating after milking and feed delivery, and during those time periods actually having a slower rate of consumption as well. So things that I described before were not only positive from a intake perspective, but also could have a positive impact on just the dynamics of the rumens in those cows, as opposed to those cows that were less efficient, not only having bigger meals during those times, but also eating faster during those time periods. And it's very encouraging because there's, I believe, some newer data coming out that verifies this work, suggesting that, yeah, cows that are more efficient have what I would describe as these kind of better eating patterns. They tend to have more meals, they tend to eat slower across the day. In addition to the time course of eating, one of the other aspects of eating behavior that I find fascinating, but also and probably equally as important, is what the cow actually consumes. And what I mean by that is, does that cow actually eat the feed as it's put in front of her? And we often look at cows eat and we watch them sort feed and we kind of shrug it off, or we may do that, but we realize that the minute the cow starts sorting that feed, even though we provide her a TMR that's designed to be homogeneous and prevent that kind of behavior from occurring, the minute the cow starts doing that, she ends up consuming a diet that's variable in composition relative to what we expect. And when we put all kinds of time and effort into putting good diets together, we expect those diets to be consumed as they are formulated and put in front of those cows. And the minute they're not, then we start to see variable production outcomes relative to what we expect. And we have some good data to really show that. And I like going back to this data that we published about 5 years ago from another study whereby we were looking at the sorting behavior of individual cows that were all, again, similar stage of lactation, fed a similar diet and producing a similar amount of milk. And what we observed in this study is that the amount of sorting that those cows were doing on those diets correlated very well with their milk component production. And if you look here on the top left of the screen, this is an association between milk fat and sorting of long particles. And what I mean by long particles are basically these particles that sit on top of the Penn State shaker box, where 100% would mean that those cows are eating exactly what's put in front of them, and less than 100 would be sorting against those long particles. And so if we look really from right to left, what you see is that those cows that sort more against those long particles, so are selecting against fiber and long forage particles, we see those cows having a lesser milk fat percentage. And again, not a perfect relationship. We know there's a lot of things that can influence milk fat percentage, but you see here in this case over a 1 full percentage point spread in milk fat production across cows. Each of these data points represents 1 cow week worth of data, so average data for 1 cow over 1 week. And what you see is that there's a 1 percentage point spread in milk fat that we can explain by variability in sorting behavior of those cows, and that's very significant. And we see a very similar on the bottom left, right here, similar relationship with milk protein as well. And again, when we think about sorting, we often think about fiber and the influence on the rumen dynamics in terms of acid production. We think about buffering, etc. And if cows aren't consuming enough long fiber, then those things that we talked about earlier get thrown off, and we increase risk of milk fat depression, etc. But we also know that the minute the cows sort, the balance of nutrients that they're consuming gets thrown off. And that's why we also likely see this association with milk protein, which we know milk protein percentages is inherently more difficult to change, and it's going to be highly related to not only the total volume, say, of microbial protein that's production, but also the balance of amino acids that those cows are actually consuming and absorbing. And again, if cows are sorting their diet, they're not going to have that balance, and we're going to see these variable results between cows and even within cows in some situations. Another kind of neat example of how that sorting behavior can have very significant effects on production is from a study that we conducted a few years back, which I'll refer to in a few moments here as well, whereby we're looking at the feed sorting of early lactation cows fed diets that varied in particle size. And one of the things that we did after the study was actually look at those cows that were, say, more prone to ruminal acidosis in those first 4 weeks of lactation, which is kind of the time period when we expect to see some of the most occurrence of ruminal acidosis. Since we classified cows as either high risk or low risk of ruminal acidosis based on the amount of time and area that they were spending with depressed rumen pH, and then compared some of their production characteristics. And so in the case of the study, this is over the first 4 weeks of their lactation. Those cows that were low risk and high risk actually consumed a very similar dry matter intake level. And so no difference statistically in terms of their dry matter intake. What we did observe was that there was a tendency for those cows that were high risk for acidosis during that time period to have lesser milk yield. And so they produced a few kilos less milk per day as compared to the low risk cows. When we looked at their milk components and specifically fat, we saw no statistical difference. However, as we know, milk fat is very variable, particularly in early lactation, with cows mobilizing fat as well at that time period. And what we observed in that case was that those high-risk cows numerically had a little bit lesser milk fat than the low-risk cows. And putting those two things together, the actual milk yield and milk fat, and when we corrected that milk then for fat content, when we looked at the fat-corrected milk, we saw a significant difference in production between those two groups of cows. I'm showing you all this and going on this or walking you through this all to really drive home the point at the end of the day that there was really nothing different between these groups, given that they were all fed similar diets, they were eating the same amount. The only thing that we could really explain as different between these two groups of cows was the level of sorting that those cows were doing of their diets in early lactation. And if you're interested in digging down into that data, I would urge you to take a look at the paper that's cited there on this page. And what it drives home is the idea that sorting can have very significant negative effects in terms of individual and even herd level production, as we've shown in other studies. Now, what I've talked to you most about so far is kind of the ingestive behavior of those cows at the feed bunk. The other part of feeding behavior that we need to think about and consider is that post-ingestive feeding behavior, and that's the rumination behavior of the cow. And rumination, as we know with ruminant, is hugely important. Cows spend nearly twice the amount of time they spend ruminating as they do actually eating feed. And that rumination is inherently important for keeping that rumen working and healthy. And first and foremost, cows are spending significant amount of time chewing their feed to reduce the size of feed particles, increase surface area, which is then going to increase the rate of digestion, which is going to increase the rate by which that feed will eventually pass from the rumen, and also then translate into a quicker return to eating at the end of the day. And so the post-ingestive behavior is really linked to that ingestive behavior of those cows, and that the quicker cows can basically process the feed that they have consumed, that's going to then translate into a quicker return to eating and is potentially going to be then linked to their overall dry matter intake level. And I'll show you an example of that in here in a minute. And then at the same time, we also know that chewing behavior at that time also plays an important role from saliva production, a buffering capacity of the rumen as well. And so it helps keep that rumen stable that way also. And so, as I was just mentioning, it doesn't then necessarily surprise us that post-ingestive behavior of rumination is then also associated with dry matter intake level in cows. And again, this comes from that same study that I described to you earlier, whereby we associated various behaviors with, dry matter intake as an outcome. And what you see here again is a correlation between rumination time and dry matter intake, where each of these dots or points on this graph represent 1 cow week worth of data. And again, lots of variation there. Some cows ruminating very little, some cows spending a lot of time ruminating, over 10 hours per day. But if we key in on kind of our high intake, high production cows, what we see is that those cows that are consuming a lot of feed are also needing to spend a significant period of their day ruminating. And so if anything limits that rumination time, that could potentially have a negative trickle-down effect in terms of how much those cows are then able to consume, and may negatively affect the feeding behavior of those cows as well. Related to that, it's good for us to also consider when cows ruminate. And so thinking of this practically, we know that obviously cows ruminate when they're not eating. And so when cows are eating, they're not ruminating. And we typically expect cows to be ruminating during those periods of the day when cows are not at the feed bunk. And generally, that would be kind of the rest periods of the day. And we typically would associate rumination with the resting behavior of dairy cows. And there's been some speculation over the years whether or not that rumination that occurs during that time may be more important than we do also see cows ruminating while they're standing up. But the bulk majority of that happens when they're resting. And some of us have questioned over the years whether or not that's important for that cow or not. And we started to dig in this a couple of years ago with a little study that we did to look at where cows ruminate, and specifically if they do that ruminating while they're lying down or standing up, whether or not that also correlates to some of their intake and production indices. And so this is some data that comes out of a study that we published earlier this year in JDS Communications, whereby we took data again from previous studies and calculated a probability that cows were ruminating at the same time that they were lying down, given automated monitoring that we had of those different behaviors. And what we were able to demonstrate is a positive correlation between that. So those cows that had a higher probability of spending more of their rumination time while lying down versus doing that ruminating while standing, those were our higher feed intake cows. And again, what this highlights is that cows need the time, as I mentioned before, but also the space to ruminate in terms of making sure that those cows have sufficient rest time so that those cows can ruminate efficiently and then also then eat efficiently at the same time as well. And I think that really kind of ties together some of the concepts we had over the years related to cow comfort and why rest time is so important for cows. It's not only important for getting those cows off their feet, but it's particularly important for giving that cow that adequate time for her to rest, but also ruminate during that time period, which is going to then have a positive impact on digestion and then even influence then the eating behavior of those cows following that. And interesting out of the study, not only did we associate that ruminating while lying probability with intake level, but also with milk components in those cows as well. And so not only did those cows who had a higher propensity to ruminate while lying down versus standing up have higher intake, but also had higher milk fat and milk protein, as we see both a positive association with both of those milk components here. And so potentially also a benefit just from an overall rumen function there as well in terms of that position while ruminating. So that kind of covers the theoretical part of my presentation in terms of why feeding behavior is important. I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit more practically in terms of what this means from a nutritional management standpoint and how we really use this knowledge when it comes to diets and dietary management. And my first take home on this is that diets and diet composition should really be formulated to encourage consumption of basically a diet that has that good eating behavior. So small, frequent meals, hard to sort, stimulate rumination. And that's easy for me to say. We could spend an hour talking about all the different dietary factors that might be related to that. I'm going to summarize this very quickly here today and say that first and foremost, it comes back to proper forage management. And various aspects of forage management are key in terms of encouraging that good eating behavior. And so things like the quality of forage, more digestible forage is going to, as I mentioned before, and I'll come back to in a few moments, is going to lead to better eating behavior. It's going to not only be digested quicker, but then result in potentially a quicker return to eating more meals per day, more dry matter intake. The quantity of forage is going to dictate that eating behavior. And so if you've got a higher forage diet, it's going to take longer to eat versus say a lower forage diet. And in some cases, if we're in areas where we don't have high levels of forage and we have very low forage diets, that poses increasing challenges on the eating behavior of those cows, because those cows can eat those diets much quicker. And so then we need to think about what other management type things may influence that eating behavior as well. Forage type plays a big role there, dry forage versus ensiled forage. And then one of the biggest ones is the particle size of the forage. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is, we've had a lot of discussion on, is the fact that, yes, while cows need effective particle size to stimulate rumination and keep that rumen happy, at the same time, we don't need excessively long particles, because what happens in that case is that those long particles not only don't get consumed because they're often just sorted away, but also take longer to digest, resulting in longer eating times, longer chewing times as well. And I like to show one example from a study that we conducted a few years ago, just to highlight how small differences can have a pretty big impact on the eating behavior and production outcomes that we see in our cows. And this is a study that we did about 5 years ago, looking at the diets of fresh cows, whereby we tested the straw particle size in those diets. And so this was a fresh cow diet that we fed for the first 28 days in milk, and we varied the particle size of straw that was included in a small amount in that diet, and either cut that straw at 5 to 8 centimeters, so about 2 to 3 inches in length, or about 2 to 3 centimeters, so about 1 inch in length, and fed that over that time period. And what you see here is the dry matter intake level of these cows. And based on this graph, it's pretty obvious that their overall feed intake level of those cows over those first 28 days of milk was exactly the same. And so no difference observed there. Where this data got interesting is when we looked at the rumen pH profile of these cows, we started to see differences. And in this case here, we see that those cows that were fed the long straw diet had much more time spent below a rumen pH of 5.8, and so which would be typically a cutoff of subacute ruminal acidosis during that time period, as opposed to those cows fed the shorter straw diet, where they had more consistently lesser time with depressed rumen pH. And given the fact that they were eating basically the same amount of diet, we had to start thinking about, okay, what else might be different between these groups of cows? And really, again, similar to the data I showed you early, the only real difference between these two groups of cows was the fact that those cows fed the longer straw diet were sorting that diet significantly more than those fed the shorter chop diet. And as a result of that, consuming on paper the same amount of dry matter, but the composition of that dry matter being very different, and in this case resulting in a very different rumen pH profile over those first 28 days of milk, and then resulting in some production differences in those cows as well. And milk production is highly variable in the first month of lactation. We know that. But in this case here, what we observed was in terms of cumulative milk production, we saw that those cows on the short treatment tended to produce about 75 kilos, or about 165 pounds more milk over the first 28 days of milk. And so biologically, that's a very significant kind of difference in milk production. Again, based on a very small difference just in terms of dietary particle size, influencing the behavior of those cows, influencing the physiology and then production of those cows. Other things that we can do beyond kind of macro dietary things, we can think of micro kind of dietary factors which also may influence the feeding behavior of cows. And I threw up on the screen here an example of, say, feed additives, which we know stabilize rumen conditions. And again, there's more things here, but things like monensin, bicarb, yeast supplements, all known and shown in various work to have an influence on rumen conditions. At the same time, and specific to the studies that I've cited herein, what we observe in a lot of these cases is that not only is an effect on the rumen environment influence, but then also the feeding behavior of those cows. And And again, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. We don't know. It's likely the fact that the rumen gets stabilized, that has a positive impact on the feeding behavior, which then further improves the rumen conditions of those cows, and those two things feed into each other. At the end of the day, though, it's interesting to see that, because it shows, or it really highlights that link between kind of the stability of the rumen as well as the eating patterns of those cows. And just an example of that, again, to highlight, this is one of those studies that I just cited on the last slide. This was a study whereby we were feeding high production cows a yeast product and observed changes in the eating behavior of those cows with the supplementation of that yeast product, whereby we saw those cows consuming not only more meals per day at a smaller size, so things, again, that would be conducive to a more stable rumen environment. That translated in terms of these cows into greater rumination time, as well as greater milk fat content. And so, again, that potential there to modify even the rumen environment, and thus having an impact on the eating behavior of those cows. Beyond the diet, the other thing that we can consider is how we actually manage dairy cows at the feed bunk to influence their eating behavior. And one of the things that we need to consider in that realm is when a cow actually does go eat at the feed bunk, and what are kind of the motivating factors for that. And the first and most simplest answer to that question is, well, she's going to do that when she's hungry. Well, that begs another question, and that's, when is a cow hungry? And really, and probably most simply, a cow is going to be hungry when she basically digests the feed that she's consumed. She's absorbed the metabolites from that, and she's also internally processed those metabolites, absorbed those, modified those, and use those within her system. And there's a kind of a complex set of feedbacks which are going to then influence her desire to then go kind of refuel herself. And so probably the most simple way of thinking about this, and I like to use this visual in my presentations, is the quicker that cow can really digest her feed and pass that feed from the rumen, the quicker she can refill it. And that's what we see from a feeding behavior standpoint, in that when cows do a good job in terms of digesting their feed, and then also absorbing those end products of digestion, and utilizing those within the body, we see a quicker return to eating, and we see higher dry matter intake levels in those cows. Now, probably the single biggest limiting factor to that, as I described before, is something like forage quality. We know forage quality is king, not only to get the most amount of nutrients from that feed, but at the same time, the quickest digestion rate of that feed, so that that cow can return to eating much more soon. And so, first and foremost, eating behavior in dairy cows should be driven internally. It should be driven by the hunger of the cow, which should be primarily influenced by the quality of the feed that cow consumes. Now, we also know that cows will eat at certain times of the day. Typically, when we look at, say, dry matter intake over a 24-hour period, we'll see that she has peaks in feeding activity, often in the morning and afternoon. Some people have described these as diurnal patterns, or crepuscular patterns, whereby cows follow a certain time of day. Now, they may do that to some degree, but we know that even more influence on those eating patterns is things like management events. So cows will have their largest meals after feed delivery, milking, and even sometimes after feed push-up. Now, of those things, what our research has shown collectively over the years across a variety of studies is that the primary driving factor for a dairy cow fed a TMR is going to be the timing and frequency by which that feed is delivered to them, and specifically fresh feed across the day. And we've seen that a number of times in various studies, whereby feed delivery is that primary factor that drives those cows to the feed bunk. And as a result of that, when we vary the frequency of that, we see a stark change in the feeding behavior patterns of those cows. And this is one example of that, where we fed cows more often. We went from once to twice to even 4 times a day, and we see cows spending more time at the bunk, having more meals per day, slowing down their rate of intake, and at the same time also actually exhibiting less feed sorting behavior, whereby those cows actually consume a more consistent diet in that case as well. Now, I'm going through this pretty quickly, but what I wanted to get to is the fact that these things then have an influence on, again, these changes in feeding management influence the feeding behavior of these cows and then have a potential impact on the production of these cows. And this is some interesting data that comes from the Northeast US from a few years ago, whereby they were looking at herds that were classified as having high de novo fatty acid content versus, say, low de novo herds. And what they observed in that case is that those herds that were classified as high de novo fatty acid content in the milk tended to be 5 times more likely to feed at least twice versus once per day. And we know de novo is also, as you see here on the screen from that work, highly correlated with milk fat content. And so again, more frequent feed delivery should generate more consistent consumption, better feeding behavior, not only in time, but also in composition, improved rumen health, and improved milk components. And that's something that we see consistently over and over again. This was verified, or I guess corroborated, by a study that we published just earlier this year in the Journal of Dairy Science, in this case with robot milking herds that were feeding PMRs at the feed bunk. And again, in this case, comparing PMR delivery frequency of once, twice, and 3+ times a day. And I say 3+ because most of those herds were actually using automated systems feeding anywhere from 5 to 8 times per day. And what we observed, similar to that previous study, was an improvement or a higher proportion of de novo fatty acid in the milk of those herds that were feeding multiple times per day. Again, indicative of, say, improved rumen environments in those cows. Now, one point I want to make is that delivering feed multiple times per day might not always be practical. And again, even going from once to twice a day can be difficult in some scenarios. One of the things that we need to think about is the fact that, as I mentioned before, cows will eat at different times of the day and will eat on other cues as well, including return from milking. And so we don't necessarily need to, say, time our feed deliveries to match up perfectly with, say, the return from the milking parlor. And in fact, if we stagger those things, still ensuring that, say, cows have an abundance of feed available to them when they return from milking, what we see is we see more consistent eating patterns. And this was a study we did a few years back, whereby we shifted feed delivery, which was being done twice a day, from milking, which was 3 times per day in this case of the study. And by shifting that feed delivery away from milking, what we did was we created basically more stimulatory points across the day, whereby cows had more meals, they slowed down their rate of intake, and at the end of the day, what we observed was an improvement in feed efficiency in those cows, whereby we saw the rumens of those cows working a lot more efficiently. And so just an example of how we can take advantage of that knowledge too of the eating behavior of cows and modify our feeding management practices to take advantage of that. Now, I'd be amiss in this presentation not to also talk a little bit about pushing up feed and making sure that feed's present at the feed bunk when cows go there. And again, we spend a lot of time looking at this. We push up feed to make sure it's present at the bunk. I make that point all the time. We don't push up feed to stimulate cows to eat. And I think that's still a bit of a misconception in the industry. There are some people that still kind of promote that idea. The idea that cows are stimulated to eat by making sure that feed gets pushed up is kind of a dangerous one. We want to make sure that that eating behavior, as I mentioned before, is stimulated internally. It's driven by the cow. When the cow goes to the bunk because she's hungry and she wants to refuel, we want to make sure that that feed is present and available for her. And if it is, then she's going to have that good eating behavior pattern that we observe. If that feed is not there, then that then has a negative influence on the behavior patterns of those cows. Those cows may choose to wait, stand more, lie down less. They may choose to go lie down and forego an eating opportunity. And so those things can be detrimental to those cows. And so we see some of those feeding behavior effects. And this is just one example of that from a survey study we did a number of years ago. We're correlating lying duration and feeding management on farms in Canada. And what we observed was that there was a positive relationship between the lying duration of cows, so how much time cows are spending lying down, and how many feed push-ups those cows have per day. And what we observed is 0.1 hours for every 2 feed push-ups. Doesn't sound like a lot, but between the herds that we were observing, that was about an hour difference in lying duration. So that's a huge amount of time that we can keep cows off their feet and lying down simply by making sure that they have feed available to them. And then that pays dividends in terms of potential production. And we've seen that again consistently in many on-farm studies. This is probably our most recent data. This is from 200 farms. Again, these are robot farms in Canada, whereby most of these farms are using automated feed push-up means. But what we observed even across that is that for every 5 extra feed pushes per day, we saw extra milk yield on those farms. And so again, just making sure that that feed is there when those cows want to be eating is going to make sure that those cows are not limited in their feed consumption. Okay, 2 other things really quickly here as we wrap up today's webinar. We do want to minimize time that cows are without feed as well completely as we think about kind of end of day and feeding levels of cows. And the reason for that is the minute we have those cows with an empty bunk, it's going to change their eating behavior, not only potentially reducing the total amount of feed that those cows consume, but it also means that the next time those cows actually do get feed delivered to them, they're going to have a larger meal that's going to be probably eaten too quickly and have a negative impact on their rumen environment. And this is some neat data that I like to go back to, comes from Dr. Rick Grant's lab at the Miner Institute, whereby they simulated a kind of empty bunk scenario by restricting feed from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. and then also overcrowding the bunk a little bit as well, and looking at the impact that that had on those cows. And what they observed in that situation is that with an empty bunk overnight, which we'd see in many cases on small and large farms alike, in addition to some overcrowding, what they observed was then that translated into negative effects in terms of the rumen health of those cows, more ruminal acidosis, as well as reduced fiber digestibility in those cows. And then related to that, and one of the reasons for that again is that not only does that limited feed availability maybe influence the eating patterns of those cows, but also the competition that those cows incur when they are overcrowded. And what we know is that when cows are faced with overcrowding or high stocking densities, which is quite the norm within the industry, we see stocking densities often on farms of 20, 30, even 40 or more percent of overcrowding on our free stalls and especially on our feed bunks in 3 and 6 row barns. That does then change the eating behavior of those cows, whereby those cows have larger meals, they eat quicker, having a negative impact potentially on the rumen environments of those cows. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that we see associations between things like bunk space and the milk component production of cows. And this is, again, an older study from my group of a cohort of Canadian herds, whereby we observed that across a cohort of farms whereby their bunk space availability per cow ranged from 14 to 39 inches, every 4-inch increase across that range was associated with about 0.06 percentage points greater milk fat. And similar to that, and from the same study I described to you before, this study from the Northeast US looking at herds with high de novo fatty acid content in their bulk tank milk, what they observed in that case of that study was that those herds with high de novo tend to be 10 times more likely to have at least 18 inches of bunk space per cow. And that 18 inches is kind of a magical number, so to speak, because that's really the cutoff by which we see a 6-row barn or a 3-row barn having around 18 inches of bunk space. So anytime that we've overcrowded that scenario, we're going to see less than that amount of space per cow. And so in those cases where those cows don't have sufficient space, they're going to change their eating behavior, and that's going to come at the detriment of the rumen health of those cows and the milk component production of those cows on those herds. So that gets me to the end of my webinar here today, and I thank you for your attention. Just want to quickly reiterate probably the biggest take home here, and that's really how cows eat is just as important as ensuring as the nutritional composition of the feed and ensuring cow health, efficiency, and productivity. And so it's really not only what cows eat, but it's also how they eat. And so to modify that, though, we do need to think about, what feeds we do provide, how we manage that feed, and then how that feed is managed at the bunk and the environment of the cow. And collectively, with good quality feed as well as good management of that feed, we can really gain optimal health and efficiency and productivity from those diets. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your attention here today. I'd like to thank the various funders that make a lot of the work that I've described in this presentation here today possible, and hope that we can answer a few questions for you yet here today. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. DeVries. Before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
Every expectant mother knows that what she eats impacts her baby. And now research shows that is also true for our cows. Maternal consumption of ReaShure during late gestation had a positive effect on the in utero calf, setting her up for better health and potentially even higher milk production once she joins the milking string. Learn more at balchemanh.com/launch and launch your herd for life.
All right, as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Dr. DeVries, our first question, we've got one from Mahmoud. Does shifting feeding to night feeding in summer affect eating behavior?
Yeah, no, very good question. There are some studies that have been done to look at that, and I know practically some people have looked at that. One of the challenges that has been observed in the studies that have been done with that scenario is it does shift the eating behavior of the cows. And so if we feed them, say, in the summertime at night, we'll see that those cows will shift their eating behavior. They'll have their longest meal at that time period, which doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing, but what we do end up seeing then is that they almost have too large of a meal, and so that by the time those cows get back to the next afternoon, in the 4 to 6 hours leading up to the next feed delivery, their feed consumption is very low because that's the hottest time of the day. There's the feed that's sitting in front of them is already 18 to 20 hours old, and those cows do not have a strong desire to be eating at that time period. And so what we end up with almost more of a slug feeding type scenario whereby those cows are probably eating too much. They can eat up to 40-60% of their dry matter in those overnight periods and then have very little intake during the day. And my preference would be to see that intake spread out as much as possible through the day. So if we are going to be doing that, I would still like to see feed delivery occurring during the daytime as well, at least fresh feed delivered to keep that feed quality fresh, and then also keep those cows motivated to going to the feed bunk during the day as well.
All right, very well. Next question comes in from Daniel. Could you please comment about interpreting data on sorting behavior at the group level? Does it reflect sorting at the cow level?
Yeah, a good question. And I could have showed, if I had lots of time today, we could have showed you more studies where we've looked at that at a group level as well. The answer is yes and no. We have looked at sorting at a group level. Again, that's going to be influenced by the feeding level of the cows. So again, if you're feeding cows to very low refusals, it can be very difficult to interpret that, right? Because we don't know, right? If you just see a few corn scraps left kind of on in the feed bunk, it doesn't necessarily mean you saw a ton of kind of within day sorting within that group. If you're feeding for a fairly significant amount of feed refusals, I'd say like at least 3 to 5%, and you see a very drastic difference between the refusals and what was delivered to those cows, then that probably indicates that there was significant sorting going on. And what our research has shown is that when we do see that, that is reflective of the group itself. And we've correlated that to reduced production and even efficiency of production at a group level. That still doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't seeing variability within cows in terms of that sorting behavior. So even if you don't see kind of changes between cows, at a group level, it could mean that you have different cows sorting that diet based on the time of day they're getting to the bunk. That can be influenced by, say, crowding conditions. So if you've got an overcrowded bunk, you've got certain cows getting there early, sorting that feed, other cows coming to that bunk before the feed gets pushed up again. So other kind of interactions with feeding management there as well that can then influence what those cows consume. And I think that's why in a lot of those cases, when we start to see overcrowding, we see poor feeding management, feed availability, we start to see, if you start looking at the data at a group level, you see more variable production, and that's because of that variable eating behavior of those cows.
All right. Next question comes from Lauren Engelking from the University of Alberta. Can you comment a bit on what influences cows to increase their selection of long forage particles? Is it primarily when cows are acidotic or experiencing other metabolic disorders?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that we have observed both experimentally, kind of from an induction standpoint, as well as observationally, where particularly cows that are experiencing ruminal acidosis and early lactation, as well as at other time points, we do in some situations see a shift in the eating behavior of those cows. And go back to an older study that we did as part of my postdoctoral research years ago with Dr. Karen Boschman in Canada. We induced ruminal acidosis in cows, and what we saw was that the day that we induced acidosis, they completely changed their sorting behavior. They went from sorting against fiber for sorting for those long forage particles. And following that, we've observed that in a couple other studies in early lactation. Then there's been other groups that have shown similar type responses, where those cows who are experiencing low rumen pH will in fact change their sorting behavior to select for long fiber. Now, what's unknown is how much cows need of previous experience to really make that kind of decision to change their eating behavior. We know that previous experience and specifically post-ingestive feedback will strengthen those kind of responses. And so classical work looking at cows eating, say, anti-nutritional factors, the minute they do that, then the next time they're exposed to, say, a plant that has that anti-nutritional factor, they may decrease their consumption or not consume that. And the more often that happens, you see that stronger response. We saw that in our acidosis induction trials, whereby we actually repeated acidosis on cows 3 times. And by the 3rd time, the cows were starting to even refuse to eat the grain that was put in front of them, because they knew that that potentially was going to make them feel or throw their rumen off, and what I would assume make them feel kind of crappy as a result of that. So there is likely some learning that accompanies that. How much innate kind of response there is in cows, I don't think we know at this point.
All right, very well. Next question comes from Dr. Jim Aldrich. Have you looked at differences in feeding behavior between the 2 styles of AMS, forced flow versus free flow?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not directly in terms of comparing feed bunk visits. Again, we don't have kind of research capability to be able to do that and quantify that really well. Observationally, though, and basically I think my best kind of guess on that is simply to look at how often cows in forced or guided flow type systems, robot systems, are accessing the selection gate, which is going to tell you not only how many times they're going to the robot, but potentially how many times those cows are getting to the feed bunk. And one of the things that we do observe in some of those guided flow systems is cows not getting to the feed bunk as often per day as we would like. And so we would typically describe for a TMR and even a PMR, we'd like to see cows have at least, say, 8 to 10 meals per day or more. And what I've observed in some of those guided systems is cows, say, only having 4 to 6 gate passes per day, which would mean that they're not having any more than, say, 4 to 6 PMR meals per day. And so in those cases, that could have a negative impact on or that could be a negative kind of eating behavior pattern and have a negative impact on the digestion efficiency of those cows. We do see in those cases, we see a lot more gate passes, and sometimes people interpret that as those cows having more meals, but that not may always be the case either, because in some of those cases, those cows are actually having the same meal, but they're chasing, say, water that might be in a different location in the pen. And so they're having to go through their gate, have a meal, and then go find water, and then come back to the feed bunk and still kind of continue on the same meal. And so I think that's an area that really still needs a little bit more work and redefining. What we do know, and I didn't talk today, but the idea of multiple meals per day, not only from a rumen health standpoint, is hugely important across all systems, but in a robot system, it actually is hugely important just from a milking frequency and a milking interval standpoint, because both in a free and guided system, we see a direct kind of relationship between when those cows go to the feed bunk as well as their milking frequency. The idea behind a box robot type system is to try to promote as much consistency in milking behavior and spread that out as much as possible across the day, so that we're maximizing the efficiency or the time use of that robot throughout a 24-hour period. And to do that, we need cows eating across a 24-hour period and not all necessarily eating at the same time. And so then feeding management, feed quality becomes even more important under those circumstances.
Very well. Next question comes from Chen Guild. Chen would like to know, how do cows bunching impact feeding behavior and rumen health?
So the question is how cow bunching behavior influences.
Yeah,
a good question, and I can honestly say I don't have any kind of empirical data to give you kind of my or to give you an answer on that. From experience, I've been in particularly hot climates where we see more cow bunching behavior, and what my gut feeling is in those situations is that again, that what you're observing in those cases is cows end up spending more time standing inactively and not kind of engaged in the behaviors that we want them to be engaged in. And so that inactive standing is going to be taking out of their time either at the feed bunk or in their resting time, and potentially, as I talked about today, potentially have a negative impact on their kind of efficiency of rumination there as well. You will observe, again, if you watch cows that are standing in holding pens, sometimes we say, okay, the cows are ruminating, they look calm. Okay, that's fine, but we don't want them spending too much time doing that. And same thing goes with cows bunching in a barn. Even if they're ruminating, that might not be the most effective or efficient rumination for those cows. We'd rather those cows were comfortable and lying down somewhere. And so anything that we can do to minimize that type of behavior, often related to barn design, airflow, and cooling, is going to have a big impact on kind of the overall time budget of those cows.
All right, nice answer. Got a couple questions coming in from Kenneth. Do you have any data on the usage of large portions of silage in the diet? Does acid load for silages affect the behavior of cows? My experiences as a nutritionist at many high-producing herds is that wet diets, defined as 42 to 46% dry matter, does not always decrease dry matter intake if the moisture comes from the inherent moisture of the silages and or brewers. But if we add water to the same dry matter content, then we see drops in dry matter intake when we go over 52% moisture. Is this just a coincidence or not?
No, that's a really good question, and it goes back to some older data that we published again about 10 years ago, looking at moisture content of diets and the influence it had on feeding behavior and feed sorting behavior. And we saw similar, whereby when we actually on high, well, they weren't even necessarily high forage diets, but kind of moderate forage diets, whereby we added water and brought the moisture content or the dry matter content down less than 50%. We, in some cases, observed increases in sorting and actually lesser dry matter intake. And whereas in other cases, you don't see that. And so I still encourage people to try get diets that are difficult to sort, as high moisture content as possible, whereby we're still maximizing dry matter intake. Some of the difference there, and I think what that person might be getting at with the question, is the fact that if silages themselves are not that stable, I would say, as a kind of a general term, if they're not as good quality as we'd like, aerobically stable, then what we're going to see is when we do add water to those, we increase the risk of kind of secondary fermentation, particularly in warmer weather. We'll see that increased risk of secondary fermentation, yeasts and molds waking up, and that feed going off much quicker. And the cows pick up on that from an eating behavior standpoint. We see more sorting of those diets, and we see lesser dry matter intake. Whereas if those silages are wet to start with, but have good fermentation and have been preserved well, they've been packed well, they've been preserved well in the bunk, then it doesn't necessarily have a negative impact, even if we add a little bit more moisture. But it probably comes back to the overall quality of those silages to start with that's going to influence that response of the cows.
All right, and Kenneth's next question is, do you have a view on the type of energy in the diet, fats versus starch versus sugars, and which will stimulate dry matter intake from a hormonal or brain point of view?
Can you repeat that so I can process?
Yeah. Do you have a viewpoint on the type of energy in the diet, be it fats, starches, sugars, and which will stimulate dry matter intake from a hormonal or brain point of view?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and that comes back to, again, some of the post-ingestive. I think it's largely related to some of the kind of post-ingestive feedback that cows do get from the feeds that they consume, and obviously the metabolites that are produced in the rumen and absorbed. I think some of the current kind of theories, if you think about the hepatic oxidation theory, one of the primary drivers to or influences on eating behavior would be really say propionate loads coming out of the rumen and influence on the liver, and how quickly that gets processed at the liver, and then that also having an influence or having a direct kind of impact then on brain signaling in terms of the eating behavior of those cows. And where most of that often comes from is from starch, and that's why there's a lot of discussion and consideration of, around, say, starch content of say fresh cow diets, and the influence that may have on overall dry matter intake, and more kind of consideration for getting alternative energy sources into those cows. So I think there's kind of that basis there. I'm trying to remember. Sorry, I'm talking a bit of a circle here, trying to think. Are they asking what was most important, or I lost it?
Yeah, if you had a preference of one of those.
Yeah, I guess the thing is, everything in life is a balance. I would like to say, right? We can probably, and that's where we see some of the benefits of a lot of the studies that have fed alternative energy sources. We're seeing a lot more interest in feeding fat energy sources to both dry cows as well as fresh cows. And again, I'm not a fat expert, but we're seeing more balance in that, and different types influencing cows. A lot of the work that's been done looking at feeding sugars shown very positive. We know sugars do not get digested the same as starch in the rumen, do not necessarily cause the same negative impacts in terms of acidosis. And we see very positive impacts of that in terms of energy balance in cows and early lactation. question at the end of the day comes back to, okay, well, how much can we feed of those alternative energy sources from a economical practicality standpoint, and at the same time making sure that those cows are receiving the nutrients that they need or the energy that they need for their production.
Very well. Time has gotten away from me. We're well past the top of the hour, having fun, and it just got away from me. Still some questions we didn't get to. I promise we will cover those during the upcoming podcast, Real Science Exchange. Would encourage you to check that out if you haven't so far. So with that, I want to thank Dr. DeVries, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues in 2 weeks on June 21st, when we welcome Dr. Carol Cardona from the University of Minnesota. She will discuss how the industry is surviving highly pathogenic avian influenza and the new research surrounding it. Visit balchem.com/real science for more details and to register for all future webinars. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform or visit balchem.com/podcast. We're closing in on our 50th episode, so there's a lot of wonderful topics out there to choose from. Subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and shirt size, and we'll send you a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. DeVries, thank you for joining us today.